Welcome to a brief video on my fundamentals of critical thinking. Now, first of all, when academic philosophers use the term critical thinking, they're not necessarily talking about negative thinking. I know the word critical implies negativity, but that's not necessarily the case. It just means careful, logical thinking. The steps of critical thinking can be categorized into three different broad areas. First of all, analyzing others' arguments. Second, constructing arguments of our own. And last, repairing arguments, whether our own or someone else's. We're going to unpack each of these steps one by one, and I'm also going to cover some bonus techniques. So first, I should say that when you hear the word argument, when used in the academic philosophical sense, it's not the same way that the term is used in everyday conversation. An argument is actually a technical term used by philosophers, and it means a series of claims called premises intended to logically support another claim called the conclusion. And an argument doesn't have to happen between two different people. In fact, in most cases, arguments are proposed by a single person, although they usually cobble together premises that they've taken from other parties. So an argument doesn't require two parties, nothing to do with people banging heads with one another. Instead, a series of claims called premises intended to logically support another claim called the conclusion. Now, the first thing you want to do when you want to analyze an argument, you're presented with an argument, is to identify exactly what it is the person is saying. And oftentimes arguments will be presented in long paragraph form with lots of extraneous stuff that really isn't relevant to the central point they're trying to make. And so it's your job as the junior philosopher to throw out all the extraneous stuff and identify what the core argument is. And you can do that by looking for premise indicators and conclusion indicators, which will give you some hint as to what it is that the person is actually trying to say, what point it is they're trying to actually prove. See, some premise indicators include since, because, for, given that, suppose that, it follows from. Conclusion indicators would include therefore, thus, hence, consequently, and so, although many times arguments are given in a very informal fashion and you won't see these actual indicators. But here's an example argument. Because, a premise indicator, this patient has a fever, a high white blood cell count, and green discharge from her sinuses. She therefore, a conclusion indicator, probably has a sinus infection. So now what you can do to better analyze this argument, and it seems to be a decent one on its face, but we want to be able to look at it more carefully, you want to assign numbers to the various claims. Then you can use those numbers assigned to the claims to actually diagram the logic and see whether it actually makes sense. And so, because, 1, this patient has a fever, so that's going to be premise 1. 2, this patient has a high white blood cell count. You have to fill in that extra phrase because it wasn't there in the original statement. That's premise 2. 3, this patient has green discharge from her nose. Those are the three premises. Therefore, conclusion, probably has a sinus infection. So, diagrammed, you can do it like this. 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 5. And actually, 5 is an implicit premise, something that wasn't directly stated but was in the background and was assumed. And that is, any patient who has a fever, a high white blood cell count, green discharge from the nose probably has a sinus infection. That's just implied and taken for granted. So you got those three premises, those three symptoms, plus this broad statement about when people have those symptoms, it means they have a sinus infection, equals or supports a conclusion for have a sinus infection. Those conditions were met, you got the sinus infection. Oftentimes, arguments are diagrammed in this fashion, going up from top to bottom. I prefer to do it from bottom up. You can do whatever you want, but this makes more sense to me because it's like the roots of a tree. You got the roots of a tree down here at the bottom, and they're supporting the trunk. And at the very top, you got the leaves of the fruit, which is the conclusion. You can diagram that. It's just for your own analysis efforts to suit your style best. Now, once you've identified the argument, the next step is to analyze its internal logic. Now, you may be tempted to jump ahead and say one of those premises is false. The patient really doesn't have a fever. That's fine in most cases. But if there's disagreement over whether or not a premise is true or not, what you can do is you can look at the internal logic. And if it turns out the internal logic doesn't work, then it doesn't matter whether the premises are true or not. If the logic breaks down, even if the premises were true, you would still throw out the argument. So it usually pays to consider that internal logic. Now, here are some technical terms. A valid argument is an argument where if the premises were true, the conclusion would have to be true. And these are arguments that typically involve all statements. And here's an example down here. All nurses have advanced training. That's a premise. Ted is a nurse. The premise. Conclusion, Ted has advanced training. You've got a broad statement about all nurses. And here we've got this represented with this little diagram. Here's the category professions requiring advanced training. That's all these professions inside this broader circle. And then you can see professions that are within this. There would be more, of course. It's just for illustrative purposes. And one of those professions lines up with premise 2. Premise 1. Nurses. Here's the category nurses, and it's within this broader heading of professions requiring advanced training. And then you've got the individual from premise number 2, Ted within that category, which is within the broader category. So the conclusion that Ted has advanced training follows from the premises that all nurses have advanced training, because if you're within that category of professions requiring advanced training, and you're Ted, you're one of the individuals within that category, well, then it has to be the case you have advanced training. Now notice, just looking at the internal logic, you've not questioned the premise of whether or not Ted is actually a nurse. Maybe he's not. Maybe he's pretending to be a nurse. He's not really a nurse, which would mean the conclusion wouldn't actually follow. Maybe it's the case that not all nurses require advanced training. Maybe if you go to some country somewhere, you can just sign up to be a nurse without any training whatsoever. That's the next step in argument analysis. When we take a look at the premises, see whether they're actually true, how likely they are to be true. And the questions you want to ask yourself when considering the truth of a premise would be things such as, does this conflict with my personal experience? Is this confirmed by an unbiased expert? If it's in an unfamiliar area in particular, is this an expert I can trust? Do they have a conflict of interest, etc.? And so here's some premises that you can consider that are offered from various sources. So a physician says any patient who has a high fever, a high white blood cell count, and green discharge from their sinuses probably has a sinus infection, or from their nose has sinus infection. The Surgeon General says all nurses have advanced degrees. Matt, the philosophy professor, says we have good reason to believe the conclusion of an argument with plausible premises is valid or strong internal logic. These are all from fairly credible sources: the Surgeon General, a physician, Matt, the philosophy professor. Here's someone who's a non-expert making a statement. Howard Stern, we have good reason to believe the conclusion of an argument with plausible premises and valid or strong internal logic. It so happens to be the case that this statement is true. It so happens to be the case that I say the same thing. But we wouldn't just take Howard Stern's word for it, unless he's actually been studying philosophy. Maybe he's taken a class like this. Maybe he really is an expert. Now consider this claim that is offered by a known pill addict. My neck really hurts. Symptoms warrant an OxyContin prescription. Now, of course, you might question this statement. It's hard to get in. I guess we can't get inside of the patient's head and figure out whether or not their neck actually hurts. But they're a known pill addict, and they don't have any other symptoms that would indicate that they actually have neck pain. There's no injury, etc. There's no swelling. They're a known pill addict, etc. You might have a reason to question this particular claim. Now, if a physician says my neck really hurts, my symptoms warrant an OxyContin prescription, they're not known to be a pill addict, I have reason to believe them over the pill addict. Here's a public relations officer from Exxon. There's no credible scientific evidence that global warming is true. Here's a Harvard climatologist. There's no credible scientific evidence that global warming is true. So if you have two different parties that are saying the exact same thing, one of them, the public relations officer for Exxon, has some motive, has some incentive to slant the evidence, slant the claim in a particular direction to benefit themselves. The other party presumably doesn't have such a motive. Now, some have argued that academic climatologists do receive grant money from various sources and would have reason to conclude that perhaps climate change is true. But in this case, this Harvard climatologist is saying there's no credible scientific evidence that global warming is true. Maybe that department is receiving funds from Exxon. I don't know. That would be the sort of thing that you would need to ask yourself when evaluating a claim in an area over which you have no expertise. If you have direct experience, you have direct expertise, you don't have to defer to outside authorities. But when you do, always examine whether or not they have a motive to mislead. Now, constructing arguments, you don't just want to sit back and absorb the arguments of others. You want to be able to formulate your own. You do this, notice that philosophers construct arguments in a fashion similar to the way scientists reveal truths about the empirical world. They've got the scientific method where they state a hypothesis, they design an experiment, they test, they analyze the results, and they draw conclusions. Philosophers do something very similar, although we don't enjoy the luxury of dabbling in the empirical world, dealing with non-empirical questions. Sometimes there are empirical components to these arguments, of course, but primarily and largely our expertise lies within dealing with non-empirical questions. And you can see that the method that we follow is similar. State the candidate argument, clarify, unpack the concepts, identify the premises and conclusions, reword statements more clearly if you need to, discard extraneous stuff, diagram the argument. And then judge, examine the internal logic, the step we just went over, determine the plausibility of the premises, another step we just went over. And then you can either endorse the argument, discard the argument, or try to repair it, which we'll go over in just a second. But the goal, as you go through this process, is to figure out what makes the most sense. When I mentioned the Harvard climatologist that might have been receiving funds from a particular source, or the public relations office from Exxon, or you might consider an attorney representing a client, these are parties that have a set agenda. These are parties that have a motive to steer us in a particular direction. The philosopher's approach is to steer us toward whatever makes the most sense, is to steer us toward truth. It's not to have made up our minds beforehand. It's not to go in and try to prove that we're correct and everyone else is incorrect. Instead, it's to go in with an open mind and to be willing, if given good enough reason, to change our own minds and to examine evidence and arguments based on the value and the force of those actual arguments. And so it takes a certain disposition to be a good philosopher, just like it takes a good position to be a good scientist. If scientists went out and tried to prove their hypotheses all the time and weren't open to contrary evidence and would just close their ears when people offered contrary evidence, then we wouldn't have made nearly as much scientific progress as we have. The same would happen in the philosophical community when it comes to examining non-empirical questions. If philosophers didn't tackle these big, interesting questions with an open mind, with a willingness to change their mind if given good enough reason, with a ruthless pursuit of the truth, then we wouldn't have made as much progress as we have. Now, it takes courage, it takes a respectful disposition, it takes humility to admit that you're wrong when you are wrong. It takes honesty and openness to do this well, and I hope that you'll cultivate some of those dispositions as we go through these exercises and such, and as you learn more about philosophy. I'm certainly not perfect in all these regards at all. I do try, and that is the ideal. Now, some bonus tools of analysis and argument construction. First of all, conceptual analysis. Conceptual analysis is important because oftentimes we'll use concepts without having a clear indication of exactly what they really mean. So here's an example argument. A person says, it's going to be sunny tomorrow. Say, for example, they're the weather person. And tomorrow, it's not sunny. And you claim that they lied to you. You say that weather person lied to me. Oh, they're such a liar. They lie to me every week. They keep tricking me. Well, before you can actually call them a liar, before you can actually legitimately conclude that they did in fact lie to you, you need to think a little bit about what the concept of lying is. And when you look at it upon careful analysis, lying actually entails passing off something that you know or have good reason to believe is false as true. If the weather person said it's going to be very sunny tomorrow after having looked at the radar and ran their simulations and had a 95% probability that it was actually going to rain, then you could say that they were a liar. They had really good reason to think that it was going to rain, yet they said it's going to be sunny. That was a lie. However, if they did their analyses and they ran their simulations and they had a 95% probability or confidence that it was going to be sunny, and they said it's going to be sunny, but it wasn't sunny, they were just mistaken. So if a person makes a mistake, they're just incompetent. Or they made a mistake if it's 95%, forgive them. It doesn't mean they're necessarily a bad weather person. They just screw up every once in a while. But if they intentionally misled you, then you can say that they lied to you. But we wouldn't be able to determine whether or not this argument was fair, the premises and the conclusion, without better understanding what it means lie. So we would hone in on this particular portion of this particular claim, unpack it, and that's how we would analyze this particular argument. Reasoning fallacies. There are some mistakes in informal logic and critical thinking and argument construction and evaluation that are so common that philosophers have given them their own names. And please review these, and you can review a lot more of them at fallacyfiles.org, and you can see a hyperlink to that website and to a taxonomy of various fallacies here at the bottom of the particular page. One of the most common reasoning fallacies is the genetic fallacy. There are many different forms of this. The genetic fallacy occurs whenever you either reject or endorse an argument based on its source. So say, for example, you really like the person saying it, so you conclude that it must be good, or you really don't like the person saying it, so you conclude it must be bad. Two examples here. One, German Shepherds are terrible dogs because Hitler owned them. Or two, the border wall is a tremendous idea because Trump supports it. Of course, it's the case that German Shepherds are either wonderful dogs or terrible dogs. independent of whether or not Hitler owned and enjoyed them. And of course it's the case whether or not a border wall would be a fantastic or a terrible idea, independent of whether or not Trump supports it. Hitler was not an expert on German Shepherds as far as I know, and even if he was, his pleasure of German Shepherds, the fact that he enjoyed German Shepherds, that he owned German Shepherds, which he actually did, there are photos of Hitler with German Shepherds, says nothing at all about whether or not they're good or bad dogs. Same thing with the border wall idea. Trump likes it, he promotes it. If you're a Trump fan, that doesn't mean it's automatically a good idea. You would need to consult with border security experts. You need to think about the implications. Just because someone that you like endorses an idea doesn't mean it's a good idea. And just because someone you don't like endorses an idea doesn't mean it's a terrible idea. So don't make that mistake. That's a very common fallacy. Reasoning with numbers, oftentimes you'll see folks that'll throw in various forms of statistical analyses or quantitative examples to help bolster their arguments, and sometimes they'll do this in a misleading fashion. So here's an example. Exact same numbers presented in two different ways. One on the left, a much more misleading way than the one on the right. So there's been a massive increase in housing prices this year, and as you can see, just at a glance, it looks like housing prices have doubled or even tripled in the past year. If you look more carefully, though, you can see they've just went from $80,000 to $82,000 average. Well, the person who presented this particular graph could say, well, it obviously says right here that it just went from 80 to 82. But you could retort and say, well, look at the way you presented this information. You've got it displayed in such a fashion that to the casual reader, the casual viewer, it looks much more dramatic, especially with this headline. However, if you'd presented the information like this, it would have been much more transparent, much more accurate, much more fair. Your exact same information, housing prices went up from 80,000 to 82,000 in a much more truthful graph. So when you make arguments of your own, if you use numbers, please be forthright about them. Remember, the purpose of doing philosophy and the purpose of being just a good citizen is to help figure out what makes the most sense together. And if you just try to trick one another with numbers, well, it just becomes a game of trickery, which I have no interest in playing, and I doubt that you do either. Understanding cause and effect. Sometimes people will conclude that simply because an event follows another event, the first event caused the second. Back in the 90s, President Clinton took lots of credit for the economic boom, and Democrats have praised Clinton's economic policies since then as being masterful and wonderful, etc. During President Obama's term, the housing market saw a terrible crash, but Democrats have distanced themselves from taking any responsibility or for playing any responsibility for that on President Obama. So in some cases, people say that, well, a president appointed particular political appointees and they set in place particular policies and they had favorable results, and therefore we're going to take credit for that. Or in other cases, well, that had nothing to do with our particular president, and it was just something that happened to occur afterwards or happened to occur at the same time, etc. Well, truth be known, the economy is much more complex than what any one president can influence. And while they have some impact through their appointments and through their policies on the United States' economic prosperity or lack thereof, they don't have so much control that they should receive a whole lot of credit. And so just because a policy is enacted and then the economy goes in this direction or that direction doesn't necessarily mean it was the policy to blame or to credit. The dot-com boom happened during the 90s, and there was a housing market bubble during President Obama's term. So maybe it's the case that President Clinton doesn't deserve as much credit as Democrats would like to give him, and maybe it's the case that President Obama doesn't deserve as much blame as Republicans might like to give him. So just because an event follows another event doesn't mean the first caused the second. Don't make that critical thinking mistake. And last, reasoning by analogy. An argument by analogy occurs when you compare two different cases and you say that the second case is relevantly similar to the first case, and therefore we should apply similar logic to the second and draw similar conclusions. Now here's an example. Here's an argument. Women are allowed 3 months of maternity leave after giving birth in some circumstances at some companies, etc. And a person concludes that, well, since the father's becoming a parent too, he also deserves just as much paternity leave. He should receive 3 months as well. Well, we need to do is compare these two examples and see whether or not the logic holds. Now, relevant similarities, both the father and the mother contribute to the child's creation. Both of them desire to bond with the new baby, and the new baby benefits from their love and presence. All that's true. However, some relevant dissimilarities between the mother and the father of a new child. The mother typically needs time to physically recover after birth, whereas the father typically does not. The mother sometimes needs to breastfeed, whereas the father does not. The mother often undergoes drastic hormonal changes, sometimes affecting mood and cognition after birth, whereas the father typically does not. So upon closer analysis, we can see that, in fact, it's the case that both parents contribute to creation. The baby would benefit from both the parents being around. But there are relevant similarities between the mother and the father in terms of the burden of pregnancy and giving birth and the impact after birth that would break down this argument by analogy. Maybe it's the case that fathers deserve some time off, and maybe they deserve 3 months, but it wouldn't be because the father also contributes to creation. It wouldn't be because his burden, at least based on this initial analysis, is equal to that of the mother's. Doesn't seem to be the case at all, and so you could throw that argument out. That's how you analyze arguments by analogy. And for a good video on moral argument by analogy, I've got a hyperlink here in the PDF. And last, for pairing arguments. Say someone offers you an argument, you conclude that it's not very good. You might be tempted just to throw it out, but I recommend that you examine it a little bit further and see what you can do to perhaps recycle portions of that argument. If you do so, you might help reconcile differences with the person who's offered it, and you might learn something yourself. So, for example, a person says, the National Weather Service has issued a severe thunderstorm warning for Knox County until 10 p.m. Plus, ominous black clouds are visible in the distance moving this way, and my horoscope said something bad was going to happen today. Therefore, a bad storm is going to hit soon. So here's the argument formalized with numbers and such, and you could draw this out with the plus signs and the arrows and all that. Hopefully, the premise that my horoscope said something bad was going to happen today stood out to you as an implausible, something that really doesn't contribute to the argument. Now, you might be tempted to throw out the entire argument and say, well, maybe it'll be sunny today. We don't know. However, you can just throw out that one premise and then come back and say, well, if the National Weather Service has predicted this terrible storm today, and if it's the case that we actually see these black clouds coming in, we actually have good reason to think that there's going to be a bad storm today. And so we might go ahead and conclude that way. So I encourage you to recycle arguments, to reformulate them, to also examine your own arguments with as much of a critical and a careful eye as you do others. I know I myself have created and believed and professed arguments that turned out to be weak and be in need of repair. And the fact that I've remained open to change my mind and to change those arguments and to change my views means that I've grown as a thinker, and I encourage you to do the same. Thanks so much for your attention. I hope you've enjoyed this brief lecture on my fundamentals of critical thinking. And remember that you can download the PDF if you like through the further information there available on the video link. Thanks so much.